Hello, mate. How you doing?
Hello, Joe. I think this is the first time I personally have ever debated someone in the same 24-hour period that I've judged them in a debate, although this is a significantly weightier topic, I think, than the debate you and Daniel had earlier. So this is your show. I'll let you let the audience know what it is you're defining as CPS and why you think it should be ended altogether.
All right. So I'm getting a little feedback. All right, here we go. So CPS is a name of a governmental agency in many states of the United States responsible for providing child protection, which includes to responding to reports of child abuse and neglect. Um, some states have a different name, but I'm going to call the overall statement to be CPS because you got Department of Children and Family Services, Social Services, and Human Services. Specifically in the state of North Carolina, from most of my childhood, it was DSS, but now it is went to CPS within, I think, the last 10 years. So I want to start this debate off with an emotional statement to those who are watching, one that affected my life for many years. In the fourth grade, I was attacked by police officers when I got off the bus one day. This was about a week and a half after the Columbine shootings. When I got off my bus, I had a grown police officer slam me to the ground, remove my backpack, have his knee on my back, and hold me and search me. Upon the end of the search, I was dragged through the school to the principal's office. When I got to the principal's office, I was there met with Child Protective Services, or at the time DSS, two counselors from DSS, the principal, and the assistant superintendent for the state of North Carolina. They had told me I was a suspect in a possible school shooting going down that day. After 2 hours of deliberation, they brought in the students who made the claim towards me, where these 7 students admitted that they lied, that they did this purposely to get me in trouble. After that, I was subjected to weekly CPS visits to my school. All of this time, my parents had no idea any of this even happened. And they were not told a single time that any of these statements happened. I was suspended for school for 2 weeks, and I was removed from all extracurricular activities to include, but not limited to, sports and field trips for my school. And I was constantly hounded by CPS. And I was forced to do therapy and other things. And all the while, my parents had no idea that they were under investigation by DSS. And at any moment in time, one minor slip up from me, I would have been removed from my loving parents. And I think that is something that we as a society ought to regret. With that being said, there are other reasons why I'm against CPS other than my personal feelings. My personal feelings is what drove me to find the information that I'm going to be bringing up to y'all. I'm going to give you 7 reasons that CPS ought to be ended. I'm going to keep it short and sweet with each one because I don't want to slam out too much information and not give Tom here a good amount of time to respond. So 1, poor families and minorities are specifically targeted. 2, mistakes do not equal bad parenting. 3, CPS is fraudulent. They are known for falsifying documents. 4, ending families equals a profit to the government revenue. 5, CPS is protected. They do not have to open records. They can close all documents from public view. 6, there's incentives built in for abducting children. And then 7, they can and will double dip into the money bin for foster family, into what the state can be, because a state is technically, even if you're in a foster family, the state is still technically the guard. They are still the legal guardian, and they have full custody of you and not the foster. With that, I'm going to give it to you, Tom.
It's actually a little bit relieving that you started off with an anecdote, because as the only debater on CallOut who has actually sued DCS in my own state, I'll be starting off with some anecdote as well. When I was in private practice, I did a fair amount of family law. On one occasion, I went to court with a cousin where DCS was involved. The mother of his child had made a report that turned out to be false, that he was doing drugs. The court had issued an emergency custody order. It basically cost him Christmas and then an extra month with his daughter. In another divorce case that I had, we still don't know who made the DCS or CPS, in your instance, report on the father, alleging that the home was unfit in a divorce case, and he had shared residential custody in that instance. There, we had a single home visit with a DCS officer. He was satisfied with the situation in the home, although he did advise my client maybe to cut back on the bunk bed wrestling that was going on at the time, dear to my heart. And I mentioned a moment ago that we actually sued DCS on behalf of a father who received information that he had been indicated as a child sex offender by his then soon-to-be ex-wife, now ex-wife, and the report was made in part of a divorce case, and as far as we can tell, would not have gone as far as it did if she had not been a 911 dispatcher. So right there, along with your own story, I've had numerous encounters with, in Tennessee, DCS, but Child Protective Services in my own state, where things have spiraled out of control. Now, that said, the resolution is that CPS ought to be ended. We have these instances where the system has failed, where you've had people who are overzealous within the system, but that points to a significant need for reform. Soon after Columbine was an especially taxing time for the Child Protective Services system, because they were being asked to act in a quasi-criminal investigatory manner, which is simply not what they were originally intended for. For a little bit of background for the folks watching, the very idea of CPS is relatively new. No state had a specific department for Child Protective Services until the 1960s. As late as the 1970s, there were about 10,000 nationwide, 10,000 abuse cases per year specifically investigated by DCS. By the mid-90s, it had ballooned to 3 million. So you're talking about a system that grew very quickly with a mission goal that, if you simply say it out loud, sounds good, but not necessarily either the limitations on its power or the investigatory tools either to do its job well or to do its job without stepping on people's toes. However, again, the resolution is that CPS ought to be ended. What we have had described to us by Joe and what I have described are all issues of due process. In Joe's case, and it is the case in most states that I'm aware of, that parents have to be told if there's a CPS investigation. In fact, usually the goal is to seek parental cooperation with the investigation. I don't know the specific circumstances of your case, but when due process is not followed, bad things just about always happen. And that sounds like what happened in your case was that due process was not followed. even stripping away the other things you said, if your parents were not properly involved, then the process wasn't followed there. In the cases that I've talked about, you've got a mixture. It sounds really bad to say, well, this dad had to subject himself to a home search, or a dad had to go to court over an emergency custody order that was later dissolved. But in those instances, and I'm getting away from your example here, in those instances, when you compare the inconvenience for the parents, or even the semi-tragedy of being separated from a child for a couple of months, you're weighing that against the overall mission of CPS, which is to prevent children from being serially abused or even killed. So in those instances, due process was followed. It was a pain. It caused pain. It caused, short-term harm to the parent and the child relationship, and I'd admit that. But the solution in both those cases was that due process was ultimately followed. The child was ultimately reunited with the parents, and everybody moved on with their lives, essentially. I've taken more than my initial 5 minutes, so let Joe continue on with his argument to elucidate on some of his 7 reasons, since you kind of went briefly through your 7 reasons in the first instance. I kind of want to hear more about the ones that are most important to you.
All right, thank you. So yeah, I will agree that obviously when I say that CPS ought to be ended, I want to make it clear that I do not want there to be no mechanism to help children. Obviously, I do want some mechanism in place. I just think that the reform that needs to happen should get rid of what CPS has right now. So I think CPS before 1997 overall was good. And obviously, again, CPS is just a broad term for all this, so everyone knows. So my first problem came down to Bill Clinton of the Adoption and Safe Family Acts of 1997. At this point in time, this led for the agencies to gain federal funding through each child that they bring in. That automatically incentivizes, which is the 6th one that I want to talk about. It incentivizes these agencies to get kids away from parents. The more that they do that, the more revenue that they gain, and the more power that institution has. And I think that right there is a major problem. The second one that I want to bring up is one of the overall arguments. So I do think that, like, I just wanted my anecdote to be a frame of reference, just as well as like another frame of reference is like our children are the most precious things in our lives and ought to be protected, right? Now there is 650,000 to 1 million. That number is not very accurate, but as the number from CPS, 650,000 to 1 million children are in custody. Of that, only 6%, roughly 30,000, were in serious danger from their parents. So that talks about the point that I made earlier about mistakes are not bad parenting. A lot of these cases, I think it's something along the lines of 40% were neglect. Now, neglect may seem like a serious problem to y'all, but you have to disaggregate what neglect means and what they're calling for, right? Use of marijuana is considered neglect. Now, in my state, the state of North Carolina, let's say that I get busted for marijuana. There is already something that gets sent to CPS through the police force that states that I and my family should be investigated because I smoke marijuana and my daughter is in my custody. That is an egregious crime. And the next that I want to talk about is that they don't have open records, and that when they are forced to open their records, they will, by all rights, defend the fact that they are fraudulent and lie on many cases so that they can continue to prosecute against parents. I'm going to give everybody a quote from Nancy Lynn, the Democratic civil rights lawyer that was in the case between let me pull up the case right here. Presley Hardwick versus Orange County, and Marcia Vreeken, Elaine Wilkins, the estate of Helen Dwojek. I'm sorry if I butcher these names, but I will leave that link up. She said in the court proceedings, CPS should be able to use false evidence in court in order to get custody. The government knows what's best for your child. This went to a district. This went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, to where it was finally slammed down that the court district affirmed that there is no absolute and qualified immunity to social workers who alleged malicious, used perjured testimony, and fabricated evidence to secure plaintiff's removal from her mother. There are other numerous cases. One to look at is Santa Clara County, California. There was a CPS epidemic where they had found that they were taking children from parents through perjured evidence and handing them off to foster parents who were on the sex offender list. All of that, I think, should have the point that CPS ought to be ended and another mechanism either take its place that has more oversight, more regulation, and better watchdog groups, or overall, we remove the system itself and give it to local jurisdictions and the police force. That's on you, Tom.
Well, the first thing that I would say when I mentioned due process earlier, and you've actually just described to us an instance of due process with this Ninth Circuit case. When they say no absolute or qualified immunity, I'm assuming this was either a libel or slander case because those are libel and slander concepts.
Yes, it was.
And that's probably a civil rights case under Section 1983. But and this is a frustration that people outside of the law have with the idea of due process is sometimes it does take a lot of years and a lot of yelling, and you have to get to a pretty high court, and the Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit is basically one of the second highest courts in the entire land, but they ultimately got it right. And what they laid down then becomes the law for the rest of the land. In the instance of DCS and CPS, it often does take getting to an extremely high authority to handle or to deal with their actions. But once you get there, due process often takes over. I mentioned that we, in fact, sued DCS just to stop one of their own internal processes, simply indicating someone on an internal list as a potential child predator. And we were successful. We got a preliminary injunction in that case, and it stayed in place until well after the divorce was finalized. It was only dissolved because our client decided to drop it, and because after that, DCS pursued no further real action against him. So you're correct that some people have made that DCS has pushed its power, but nearly every government agency has done that. Speaking of agencies that are allowed to lie in order to accomplish their goals, you mentioned turning DCS's or CPS's role over to the police. The police are allowed by Supreme Court precedent to lie in order to secure an arrest, to secure a confession. They're allowed to lie. They're not allowed to lie to support a warrant, but they can rely on somebody who later turns out to be lying to support a warrant. So all of the flaws that you've pointed out in the system as far as the incentive to use bad evidence or fabricate evidence do exist in the police system. Even though they're not supposed to, police do lie in court. We know this. They lie before grand juries. We know this. They lie on police reports. They lie to get witnesses to say something that is not necessarily true. They even in some cases suborn perjury. So The very same hedges that I'm saying should apply to DCS are what we have to rely on to hedge against bad police work. So when you say we should dissolve CPS and turn those same functions over to the police, you're exchanging one set of potential bad actors for another. And the same remedies that I'm saying we should apply to DCS are all you would have to rely on when it would come to the police. Now, turning to the issue of financial incentives, you say that there is an act in place that provides federal funding per child for agencies. I assume when it comes to foster care, children in state custody, there's children in police custody of the state in child prisons, but that's a separate system and administered by different programs than the foster care system, the group home system, because those are not children who are accused of committing crimes themselves, or they haven't been found guilty of serious crimes. But when you say that there's federal funding available and that there's a financial incentive, I have two questions. First of all, who gets the money and why does it incentivize them? Unless you can show that there is some personal benefit to CPS or DCS agents when this money comes in, or that there is some independent financial incentive of the department that this money goes somewhere other than the care of the children themselves, then it's a hard case to make that the federal funding is incentivizing taking children away that are not actually at risk. Second, comes from another part of my legal background. Here locally right now, there's a big hullabaloo because right now we're bidding to get federal inmates into our local jail, and they're talking about how much money we're going to get from the federal government per day for these prisoners. What nobody seems to be talking about is how much per day does it cost to actually house these prisoners and to follow federal rules for doing so. And when you look at the hard numbers, the money that we're going to get from the federal government is significantly less than what it actually costs to house the prisoners. I would flip that around for the children in foster care. Again, if the money that they're getting from the federal government is not significantly more than it actually costs to house the child, or if it's less than what it costs to keep the child in foster care, it's difficult to see how there's a financial incentive to keep these children in custody. Now, you point to the definition of neglect, and you point to the marijuana example. But I note that you said that if someone is arrested and convicted of possession of marijuana, that there's a police letter sent to CPS. That sort of information sharing is very different from an automatically opening an inquiry into whether a child is at risk over a simple possession charge. So I would challenge you on that. What percentage of these referrals are actually investigated? What percentage of the investigations turn into custody battles between the state and the parents? And in what percentage of cases is there an eventual reconciliation? Because when you say that there's 650 to 1 million children in custody, in most cases, the ultimate goal is reunification with the parents, termination of parental rights. You're talking about those 30,000 that were in serious danger from the parents. The state generally doesn't want to hold on to these children unless they have to. And so finally, when you say you don't believe that there should be no mechanism to help children, I would have to challenge you on what you point to. Move it to local jurisdictions and the police force, but I've already addressed that the significant flaws you point out with DCS and CPS would almost certainly equally apply if you simply turned it over to a police function. In fact, in your anecdote, you didn't first note the DSS counselors. You first noted the police officers who dragged you off the bus and were physically violent with you. And this is, as we know, a more typical characterization of a police encounter than it is with a DCS or CPS encounter. You noted your DSS encounter started with psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, etc., continued through monitoring. But when you talk about physical violence towards you as a child, that was specifically the police. And I'd say that this paradigm is familiar to all of us, that when you talk about police, you're talking about violence, and violence is certainly not preferable to a system that first seeks counseling remedies, even if it also seeks other more extreme remedies. That's a big mouthful for me. I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you for a different mouthful.
All right. No, I think you brought up some really great points, and this does elucidate a lot of the ideas. So, in the beginning, like I said, I wanted to make this as much of a discussion as it was a debate, but I'm actually really enjoying this debate format. So first of all, I do agree with your statement about the law. That's not something that I'm privy to as a non-lawyer type. So I do have to agree, but I did make the caveat that it doesn't have to be the law. I just said that is one mechanism that it could be. I'm not trying to write the law. That's why I'm having an ought here. So I just think that it ought to be ended. How it's done later on, the mechanism, I'm not sure. There's better minds than mine. Possibly you could come up with a better plan. And I do think that there is a better plan at the end of the day. When we view the two worlds, I think that the world with CPS versus the world without CPS, but a different mechanism that is better, should be the one that people vote for and look at. Now, let's look at this. So, like, who gets the money? Is there some personal benefit? I honestly am not 100% sure. I do know that it does go towards the social workers' wages. I'm just not exactly sure what that count is, and I base that off of the foster care costs. So typically, foster care goes to a non-parental family member, and that is most likely a grandparent. Now, the average child cost across the United States to a foster parent is $500. I think that the gain per child is greater than that $500 a month. So there is a significant chance that that is going somewhere else. Now, where that goes, it might be an administrative and things of that nature. It's a definite possibility, but it's something that ought to be investigated more. That is for sure. Next, we talked about how many of these children are looked at to be investigated versus how many are investigated. So the 6.3 million children are looked at to be investigated. 3 million are subjected to investigation. Of those 3 million subjected to investigation, 80% is the number that comes up. So now I want to talk some more about why I have a problem with the due process argument. So you said that for this due process to work, that it has to hit a higher authority. And I agree. The United States governmental system and judicial system is probably one of the best on the planet, but there are still problems with it. And this goes back to my first thing, is poor families are targeted. Poor families, it is much harder on a poor family to take this to a higher court, to hire a lawyer. So obviously they're going to target that family more so if there is an incentive. And even if there's not that incentive, again, we don't even have to have that. Even if that incentive is not there, they're still going to specifically target the poor families because the poor family cannot take it to a higher court. The court case that I brought up, I should have made this clear. It was not the parents suing Department of Social Services. It was actually the child, upon turning 16, started a case to sue CPS. So I think when we look at these problems and we see how CPS works, that there ought to be a better plan and in place for this. Because I go back to the statement that I made that, right, these are children that are being ripped away from their parents. And I hate to use the emotional argument here, but you as a father and me as a father, we can understand how awful that must feel to, some minor action somehow comes to the point that we lose our child. And that we just have to, try to deal with it, or, lose our jobs, lose our livelihoods because we're having to pursue action against an entity that is legally abducting our children. I mean, I just find that just the craziest thing. Also, to the point about the police officer, if you're busted, it does automatically open the investigation. CPS has the choice to pursue that investigation, and like I said, if it's a family, then they're obviously going to target. Now, I want to talk about the state, the ward of the state problem and the foster care problem. And I talked about this a little bit in my first speech and some in my second, is that when these children go to foster parents, it's not like they're going to a better place. When they're going to these halfway houses and other places like that, these are not good. There's many registered sex offenders that they fall upon or preyed upon. 96% of foster parents are on disability, unemployment, workers' comp, or have low-income jobs, resulting in children getting placed with unqualified and oftentimes abusive recipients. Many foster parents are emotionally unstable and mentally incompetent, and a large majority have criminal records. 93% of foster parents use the system for perverted or financial gain, using children as currency to pay rent, place food on the table, pay the bills. These financial incentives have led to unintended consequences, attracting pedophiles, predators, drug addicts, and sadists. Right? And here's another statement. The National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System reported that in 2012, 1,445 U.S. children died from child abuse. For many years, the Child Bureau, a department within DHS CPS, reported 1,000 deaths a year within the CPS system. The Children's Bureau also rounds off to the nearest 1,000. So if the real tally of children dying in state custody is 1,499, only 1,000 will be reported. Shockingly, this leaves 46 children nationwide killed outside of Child Protective Services, a government program designed to protect children. The last thing I want to say is that children coming from foster care and from going through these holes in CPS usually have higher tendencies for suicide. They have higher tendencies towards drug addiction. They have higher tendencies through becoming disappearing and missing. There are 3,292 children missing, presumed dead, after entering the CPS system, a statistic that only represents 3 states, Ohio, Washington, and Colorado. Only 33 states report foster children who become lost in the system, as it is not mandatory. These are huge numbers. And I point back to those numbers that I stated earlier of the 650,000 to 1 million children in custody of CPS, only 30,000 were in serious danger. There's any net benefit going on, especially when we apply the suicide rate and the other factors that I've brought up. So at the end of the day, there does need to be a better system implemented. And with that, I'm going to give it back to.
Yeah, I'm still here.
You still there?
I had a little bit of a hiccup on your end. I assume you had some on my end as well. Starting with the issue of child deaths, to compare to the number that you pointed out, according to childhelp.org, backed up by childwelfare.gov, between 4 and 5 children in the United States die of abuse or neglect per day. That's 1,580 in 2014, and that's just an estimate. And as you say, those numbers are just as prone to underreporting as state numbers are. So we're looking at two sides of a pretty crappy coin for these kids. You note the bad outcomes that come out of foster care, but those outcomes are still, on the whole, better by a little, not by much, but by a little, than the outcomes of children who are left in abusive or neglectful situations. Um, and and that's sort of the dilemma that we're ultimately facing here, is that we've got a system that has pretty much all the flaws that you've pointed out, even if some of the statistics are not precise or are not representative of the entire system. All of those flaws should frustrate and infuriate us to the same degree. But is the answer to scrap the system we have or to reform the system we have? I keep coming back to this, that the resolution is CPS ought to be ended. But what was the situation before we had CPS? These children who suffer these bad outcomes coming out of foster care may not have even made it there. They may have been victims of child trafficking before they ever went through the foster system in the first place. They may have suffered the same abuses at home. The fatality rates at home may have been just as bad. In many ways, we don't have the statistics because we didn't have the government apparatuses before the 1960s to track the statistics. But we know, you say 40% of children who are in CPS custody or DCS custody are there for neglect. Neglect can look like anything from parents with a habitual drug issue to parents who are not financially able to provide for the child to parents who are intentionally living in squalor or other things. Out of those other 60%, how many of those are already victims not just of abuse or neglect, but actual abuse? You say 30,000 children were in serious danger from their parents. What about children who were in danger from other family members and the parents were not taking care of it? What about children who were in danger from situations created by their parents, even if not directly from parent violence? So these are all problems, and you've conceded in this debate there needs to be some apparatus to deal with these children, to provide them some respite. And basically what we've established in this debate is that CPS isn't doing as good of a job of it as we want. Is the answer to scrap it and go back to some other system, or to reform what we have? Well, on the issue of child deaths, I want to point to Tennessee as an example of reform. We did have a serious problem not only with children dying in foster care in Tennessee, but of those deaths being covered up and not reported by DCS. Reform actions were taken, and now we've significantly curbed the number of children who die in foster care. We've significantly improved oversight of the foster care system in Tennessee, and now we have accurate statistics both of the number of children who have actually died in foster care. Again, that number has dropped since we've started tracking it accurately. And we have better tracking of who is allowed to become a foster parent in Tennessee. So there's an example where reform can happen of the existing system. I pointed earlier, we've talked about due process issues in Tennessee. There are legal mechanisms currently in the works to require DCS in Tennessee to establish meaningful due process and to reform its existing and inadequate due process. Some of this has come about because of court action. Some of it has come about at the legislative level. As you say, there are people who are working on these problems that are smarter than both of us. And what we're finding is that reform can happen. You pointed to what happened to you when you were in fourth grade. Well, that was how DSS in North Carolina, and it was how many child protective agencies throughout the country responded to what was really the first significant school shooting in America. They've gotten better. Now, instead of responding with cops, they respond with grief counselors. Now, instead of responding by questioning kids in in an interrogatory manner, like you've said, now there are more rules in place certainly than there were when Columbine happened. We have more proactive measures than defensive measures. Kids are identified at risk more on the front end than on the back end. And while certainly we've seen increases in school shootings, we can't say that there's been more. We don't hear very many stories like yours anymore, whereas the story that you shared, if people look into it, was unfortunately common at the time of Columbine and of the first couple of school shootings and a significant example of school violence after that. So should CPS be ended? Unless we have a plan to replace it, the answer has to be no, because we agree that these services need to be available for these children. We need people out there looking out for these children's interests, even if it means placing them from a terrible situation into a slightly less terrible situation. We need to do better than that, but somebody's got to do it. And the final thing that I would say, if not CPS, then what? If we can't answer that question, then we don't need to be tearing down the system. And when we've seen that reforms can happen, reforms can work, and even between the terrible thing that happened to you and today, we've seen that there have been continual reforms and that the results are improving. We have to say the answer is what seems to be reform rather than tearing it down and trying to build it back up. One good example of reform is, as you say, keeping people who are on the sex offender registry off of the foster care list, keeping people who have previous trouble with the law off of the foster care list. Even if at least a short-term dips in the number of foster parents out there, we have to suffer through those as part of the reform process. But that short-term dip in availability of foster programs is certainly preferable to scrapping the entire program altogether without something to replace it. This is totally skipping around, but one thing I forgot to mention earlier when you talked about closed records. It's certainly a problem that DCS and CPS investigatory records are closed when it comes to parents trying to find out what they're accused of. However, the alternative would be for these children's private information to be exposed when they are not able to meaningfully consent to it being exposed. So there's sort of a necessity of those records being closed where police records kind of generally aren't. So in closing, I believe the resolution ought to be voted on as con, simply because instead of being ended, I think through this discussion we've talked about many areas in which CPS simply ought to be reformed, must be reformed so that people, children who are in Joe's situation don't have to suffer like Joe did when he was a child.
All right. Thank you so much, Tom. I really enjoyed this debate. And this is obviously not one of my more entertaining debates, but I think that there was a lot of information that went about. And I think that obviously this is something that does land near to my heart. And it honestly should land to every parent's heart. And one thing I want everyone to take away from this, if you are a parent and you think that you might be investigated, lawyer up very fast and take positive action against that. Now, if you're a shitty parent, I just want you to lose your kid. I want everybody to know that. If you're a bad parent, you shouldn't be a parent. That being said, I do want to make my final voting claim here. So when I made this debate, I made it specifically an ought debate because it's something that states that it ought to be ended. Because I don't want to set up a mechanism that would be better, because I myself am not smart enough in the world to make up a better plan. Now, what I could say is, like Tennessee, we could make that a federal system. Obviously, what Tennessee is doing is good. What we could do is just scrap CPS in general and just make that Tennessee system the federal law that goes about. And I think that meets that burden alone, because I don't really want to get into it. All I want to say is that there are some serious problems, and I don't want a slightly better system. I don't want slightly better outcomes. I want a place where children are protected. They are the most precious and special entities in our life, And we ought to do better. We cannot look at the world and go, well, it's slightly better. We need a much better world. And ending CPS, that way that we could come to some real legislation and get some real minds behind it, would be the better in my world. Therefore, you should